Everyone, good morning. If you can't hear me, throw some spitballs at me and I'll get the message. But if you didn't hear that, I'll try to talk louder.
You have to speak a little louder.
Yeah, I'll try. Let me first introduce myself. I'm the son of Rabbi Greenberg and the father of Rabbis Greenberg. And I have the distinction of being the longest serving rabbi in Western New York, I think.
Really?
So those are my credits. I'm glad there's no long introduction because my wife was here, she wouldn't appreciate. Usually I start a talk with a little bit of a joke.
I'll try to set up the microphone for you.
Okay. Well, I'll just...
Yeah, keep going and maybe I'll be successful.
But when talking about Maimonides, he didn't have too many jokes in his writings. He was a very serious man. So the only joke I can say is me talking about Maimonides. Okay, you have an outline over here. I'll try to cover everything in the outline. My suggestion is that we'll spend today and another week or two on the biography of Maimonides, and then we'll get into some of his writings, specifically the laws of proper dispositions, which focuses on the ethical traditions of Judaism, the way Maimonides consolidated them into one section of his work. The two most influential Jews of the medieval period, I would say, arguably, were Rashi and Maimonides. Rashi was a leading Ashkenazic rabbi, lived in the 11th century, he passed away in 1105. Rashi passed away 30 years before Maimonides was born. Rashi was the leading Ashkenazic commentator of the Talmud, the Bible, and certainly the most influential Ashkenazic Jew in the medieval period. Maimonides was a Sephardic Jew, and he likewise was the most influential Sephardic Jew, and perhaps one of the most influential Jews in all of human history. Rambam, as he's known in Jewish circles, Rambam stands for the acronym of his title and his name, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. So if you take those initials, it spells Rambam. So I might use the name Maimonides, I might use the name Rambam, but they're the same person. On his tombstone, the words that were etched on his tombstone was, "From Moses to Moses, none arose as Moses." The only irony over here is that the name Moses was an extremely rare name in Jewish history. From the time of the first Moses until about 100 or 200, maybe 200 years before Maimonides, nobody was named Moses. In all of the Talmud, where you have hundreds of names of rabbis, not one is named Moses. And the question is asked, why no one named Moses? Likewise, no one was named Abraham until about 1,000, 1,100, maybe 1,200 years at the most. At least people that we know of. And the reason probably was that people felt it would be presumptuous to name your child Moses. After all, you're trying to compare him to the original Moses. Somehow that fear faded and people started giving the name and it became a very popular name. So we're talking about someone about whom it is said that from Moses to Moses, none has arisen like Moses. What did he accomplish? He was the greatest Talmudist, theologian, philosopher, physician, astronomer, but also a selfless leader, a theological warrior, an iconoclast, and a passionate lover and defender of Israel, of the Jewish people. He combined all of these different traits. He was the ultimate Renaissance person, and at the same time he was a very sensitive person and a very humble person. To have all these traits combined in one, and yet he was one of the most controversial people in all of Jewish history. He was constantly involved in controversy. He was held in such awe by the Yemenite Jews that when they said Kaddish, and in Kaddish he mentioned, may God's name be glorified and magnified in your lifetime. They would add, and in the lifetime of Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. He was so important because he saved Yemenite Jewry, and that's a whole story that we'll get to a little bit later in the series. The only area that we don't know if he was engaged in terms of scholarship was Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. There's no reference to any mystical teachings in Judaism in all of his works. And most historians believe that it was foreign to him. He did not know Kabbalah. He did not engage in that study. There's a minority view, however, that says he did engage in Kabbalah. He did study it, at least at the end of his life. However, he felt it was not the opportune time to teach Kabbalah, and because of various circumstances. Maybe he felt it was too powerful spiritually for the people. Maybe he felt the people were too rationalistic and they wouldn't be able to receptive to it. But it's hard for me to imagine that a man of his caliber, of his intellectual curiosity, would leave an area of study that was very well known in his time by many other great rabbis. That he would be completely oblivious to it is a little bit strange for me to accept. So I would favor the minority view that he did know Kabbalah, but he felt that it was not the right time to teach it. As I said, he was controversial in almost everything in his life. From the time he was born, there's already controversies around his birthday. We'll get to it a little bit later. Now, he was not raised in a vacuum. There are some rabbis whose parents are not known, who came out from obscurity and became great people. But Maimonides didn't have that advantage of coming from obscurity because his father, Rabbi Maimon, was an incredibly great person in his own right. And not only that, Maimonides traces his ancestry back 7 generations of Jewish judges. You know, there are different levels of rabbis. The ultimate level of a rabbi is to be a judge in Jewish tradition, and 7 generations back, most of his ancestors were rabbinic judges, and he traces his ancestry back to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the editor and compiler of the Mishnah, Judaism's second most authoritative text. So he had what we call in Yiddish and in Hebrew yichus. He had very, very great genealogy, and that, of course, certainly gave him certain advantages over others. Rabbi Maimon, his father, was a towering scholar. We have fragments of his commentary on the Torah and the Talmud, very little of it, but he was eclipsed by his son. Most people heard of Maimonides, but didn't hear of Rabbi Maimon. Maimonides also had an illustrious son, Rabbi Avraham, great man, but he's eclipsed by his father. So Maimonides did a disservice, you could say, to his father and to his son by being so great. But I'm sure they would forgive him for it. Maimonides was a Sephardic Jew. In fact, he would sign his name, Moshe ben Maimon HaSfardi, the Sephardic Jew. We don't find Rashi signing his name, Shlomo ben Yitzchak HaAshkenazi. Ashkenazic Jews apparently didn't show as much pride in their ancestry as Sephardic Jews. This is only, I don't know if that's true or not, but I don't know of any example of people emphasizing they were Ashkenazi. Although Ashkenazi became a last name for some people, it was not a title that they were proud of necessarily. Maimonides' father, Rabbi Maimon, was a disciple of Rabbi Yosef ibn Megash. Most people, 99% of the Jewish people never heard of him, but Maimonides considered him to be the greatest Talmudist of his time and said some very, very powerful words about his brilliance, how awesomely brilliant he was. Rabbi Yosef ibn Megash was a disciple of Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, who was considered to be the greatest Talmudist of his time as well. Not only amongst Sephardim, but also amongst Ashkenazim. So Maimonides considered Rabbi Yosef ibn Megash to be his teacher, although he was only about 6 years old when the man passed away. So it's obvious that he considered him his teacher through his father, Rabbi Maimon. When was he born? Here's controversy. Most traditions claim that he was born in the year 1135. No one here remembers that. Okay, we're too young for that, okay? 1135. Others say, and they base it on Maimonides' writings, that it was 1138. We're not going to go into the controversy because we're not going to be able to make any definitive conclusions. But I want to just focus a little bit about his birthday, because there's a tradition in his family that he was born on the 14th day of the month of Nisan. That's the day before Passover, in the afternoon, about 1:30 in the afternoon. Who remembers the birth date of someone who lived 800 years ago? Most great people, when they're born, they don't come out with a sign. Here comes the great Rashi. Here comes the great Maimonides. So the fact that they remembered his birthday is striking. And I think maybe a simple explanation could be the busiest day in a Jewish household is the day before Passover. That's when everyone goes crazy. And now your wife is giving birth to the bargain as well to make things even more complicated. But it was a unique day before Passover because it coincided with Shabbat, with the Sabbath. And that poses some halachic and legal issues about preparing for the Passover, for the Seder, and so on and so forth. So maybe it was a memorable day. But I want to focus a little bit on the number 14. Maimonides was big in numbers. In his major works, after discussing a subject, he will summarize it by saying, this subject has 20 points to it, and he'll enumerate all 20. Even though he already discussed those 20, he will make a point of giving you the number. And it seems that he had certain favorites in terms of numbers. It seems that the number 14 was a favorite of Maimonides, because in many of his books, he uses the number 14. For example, his first book, at least the fact that we think this is the first book he wrote, was a treatise on logic. It has 14 chapters. His book of commandments, where he enumerates all the 613 biblical commandments, he prefaces it with an introduction about the ground rules, how to determine what is a mitzvah, what is a commandment. How many ground rules? I'll give you 14 guesses. 14. His major work, the Mishnah Torah, is divided into different books. It's a massive work, and it's divided into 14 separate books. His Guide for the Perplexed, his philosophical work, his major philosophical work, he describes the reasons for the commandments, and he divides the commandments into 14 categories. Yet, when he enumerates the principles of faith of Judaism, how many principles of faith are there? Does anyone know?
14.
No? No, 13. And it always bothered me. He liked the number 14 for some reason, maybe because he was born on the 14th day of the month. But why did he not take one of the 13 and bifurcate it, divide it into two parts, which you can do, and he would have come up with the number 14. And then I came to the realization Maimonides was teaching us something very profound. There are 13 principles of faith. But the word in Hebrew for one, echad, which is the most important Hebrew word in the Bible, in the Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, echad, numerically, the letters of that word give us the number 13. So Maimonides, by making a point of avoiding using 14, said 13 principles of faith doesn't mean there's 13 different components of God. He was a fanatical believer in monotheism in the most pure form. The 13 are really all echad, they're only one. They're really all about one God. The number 14, on the other hand, in Hebrew, the word 14 is the same as the numerical value as the word yad, hand. What is the hand? The hand is what divides. You have 5 fingers in each hand. When you give things to people with your hand, you give different amounts, different volume to different people. So the number 14 in Maimonides' way of thinking represents division. The number 13 represents the idea of unity. Maimonides, there are people who see the forest but don't see the trees. There are people who see the trees but don't see the forest. You need to see both. He saw the unity that exists in the creation. He saw the unity of God that pervades everything. And he was able also to break things down into their component parts. This was part of his genius, and I think it's hinted in the number 14 and 13 that he uses. Now, Maimonides is not mentioned in the Torah, obviously. The Torah was written 3,300 years ago, and Maimonides lived 800 plus years ago. But it's hinted in the Torah. When the Torah describes the 14th day of Nisan, which is the day before Passover, the first Passover, there's a phrase there where God says, I'm going to multiply my wonders in the land of Egypt. In Hebrew, if you take those 4 words, Revot, Moftai, Be'eretz Mitzrayim, it spells Rambam. The initials spell Rambam. And it's the only place, I checked with my computer, the only place in the whole Bible, in the whole 5 books of Moses, where you can find 4 consecutive words that have the initials of Rambam. And where is that hinted? In the text that talks about a Moses who performed wonders in the land of Egypt. Now, Maimonides was named Moses. He performed wonders, maybe not miracles, but wonders, philosophical wonders, leadership wonders, where? In the land of Egypt. And that's where his birthday is mentioned. That's all a little bit of trivia, if you want to call it trivia. So at any rate, Maimonides was born at the time that we would bring the Paschal offering. And what is the Paschal offering? The Paschal offering was the symbolized destroying the idols of Egypt. Yep. Who, more than Maimonides, was an iconoclast, sought to destroy all the different beliefs that he considered to be idolatry, like black magic, like astrology, demonology, all these things. Maimonides was an iconoclast. He tried to destroy the beliefs in those occult areas of thought. So now Maimonides is growing up in a city called Cordoba in Spain. Cordoba was had a vibrant Jewish community. Okay. The Jews in Spain, we don't know exactly when they first came there, but they were there at least from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, and some suggest that they were there after the destruction of the First Temple. You're talking about 2,500 years. Jews had already migrated to Spain, and Cordoba became a major center of Jewish scholarship. And that's where Maimonides was born. And he didn't have an easy upbringing because his mother died in childbirth, so he was raised by his father and probably a stepmother. But he was given the best education you could imagine. He studied Talmud, he studied medicine, he studied philosophy, he studied astronomy, and he mastered all of those subjects. He wasn't just a dilettante who dabbled in these different subjects. He perfected his knowledge of those subjects. Even his astronomical knowledge, the astronomers today are marvel at the way how precise he was about different astronomical events. To the split second, virtually. That's how brilliant he was in the areas of astronomy, and likewise in the other areas that he engaged in. But he lived at the tail end of the Golden Age. It was a period of about 400 years, from the year 750 approximately to the year 1148. Those were the golden years, the golden age of Jewish life in Muslim countries, where Jews, although they were second-class citizens, they were dhimmis, enjoyed political, economical, cultural, religious independence. And some of them were able to attain high positions in the Muslim-governed countries. So this was a paradise for Jews. Jews didn't care about being second class as long as you had freedom to be a Jew and to grow in your knowledge. That was good enough for them. But that all ended in the year 1146 and 1148 when it came to Cordoba. There was a group of Muslims called the Almohads. I asked them forgiveness if I mispronounced their names. They came from North Africa. They conquered much of Spain that was called Andalusia, the part of Spain, and they were fanatics. And they imposed laws that required everyone to convert to Islam, on the pain of death if you refused. So everyone had to say that they believed in Allah and Muhammad was his prophet, and if you refused to say that, you would be killed. People think that the Inquisition against religions other than their religion started with the Catholics in the 15th century. No, it didn't. It started in the 12th century, in the year 1148. Now, these Almohades had a radical philosophy, radical monotheism, They couldn't tolerate any kind, certainly not Christianity. They couldn't tolerate any compromise of the belief in one God. They were anti-anthropomorphisms. That's a fancy word for saying that God has physical properties. And it's interesting, Maimonides was likewise a radical monotheist and a radical anti-anthropomorphism. Actually, his Guide for the Perplexed is divided into 3 parts. The first part is totally devoted to showing that all those phrases in the Bible that describe God's thoughts, God's speech, God's actions are all metaphors. They're not to be taken literally. So in that regard, we agree with many of their teachings, the radical teachings of the Almohads. They also rebelled against materialism. They were permeated with a messianic fervor. And you could say they were rationalists as well. They were fanatical rationalists. You know, you can be a fanatic religious person, you can be a fanatic secular person. What happened that changed the mentality of these Muslims to be very receptive and hospitable to Jews, and now turning them into fighters against Jews and Judaism? One of their leaders, his name was Ibn el-Mumin. He believed, I think it was a dream or a vision that he had, that the Jewish Messiah would redeem the Jews 500 years after the revelation of Muhammad in the year 622. So 500 years later, 1146, the Messiah had not arrived. So he took that as an omen that Jews must convert to Islam. Jews and everyone else. But the main prize was Jews. So Jews had a choice. They could either convert and survive, or they could flee, or they could suffer death. Most Jews did not flee. Many of them did flee to Christian-controlled Spain, to other countries, to Italy. They were welcomed by their fellow Jews. And that was wonderful for those people who were able to leave. But most of the Jews did not leave. Maimonides' father, Rabbi Maimon, and his family did decide to leave. And they wandered for 11 years, fleeing from one place to another. So Maimonides, how old was Maimonides in 1148? If he was born in 1135, he was 13. If he was born in 1138, he was 10 years old. He was a kid, essentially. And he was wandering with his family for 11 years until he finally came to Morocco, where they lived for 4 years. Now, why did the Jews decide to convert? Because many of the Jews felt that this was not a challenge that they had to fight for. Because they felt, on one hand, you see, the Muslims are not so different from us. They also believe in one God. They didn't accept the idea of a trinity. So our theological foundations are similar. It wouldn't be considered a form of idolatry in their minds. So they felt that was, and then they all thought that it's a temporary thing. He doesn't really mean it. It's going to end. We're optimists. We're eternal optimists, and it's going to end. And therefore, let's wait it out. And also, there was a third point. Unlike the Inquisition centuries later in Spain, not only could you not practice your Judaism openly, if they caught you practicing Judaism secretly, you would be burnt alive, ordre de fe. The Muslims didn't have that fanatical extreme. They said, as long as you publicly profess to believe in Muhammad, then we're fine with you. What you did in your home was your business. So that distinguished this kind of persecution from many other persecutions previous and later, where you couldn't even practice it secretly. So many Jews felt, and we can make this accommodation. Publicly we'll say, yeah, we believe in Muhammad. Privately we'll practice our Judaism. So most of them did not flee. I don't have, is that clock?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I do have a watch.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when Maimonides came to Morocco, he was already involved in writing books. Where he got 11 years wandering, and he finally settles in Morocco. He wrote his treatise on logic. It's a small book, 14 chapters. It's a compact primer on logical terminology. He also wrote a treatise on the calendar, which deals with astronomy. Also a small work. Now, something happened that catapulted Maimonides into fame and into his role as a leader. Until now, we know of Maimonides as a scholar. He was a person devoted totally to his studies in all different areas of knowledge. And then he became a leader. But it started with his father, Maimon. The Jewish people who were forced into accepting their belief in Muhammad and becoming a Muslim were beginning to feel uncomfortable. It was not comfortable for them to have this dual identity. In public, you're a Muslim. In private, you're a Jew. And some of them started to have doubts about their Judaism. Maybe this is a sign from God. Jews always like to look for signs that God wants us to become Muslims. Judaism was fine up until this point, and this point onward, we become Muslims. That was an improvement maybe on our Judaism. And they began to have feelings of doubt. At that point, Rabbi Maimon, Maimonides' father, wrote a letter called the Letter of Consolation, because a lot of them felt that depressed because of their situation. They didn't know what to think. And he sent this letter to them. He uplifted their spirits, gave them encouragement, told them to keep on doing as much of Judaism they can possibly do, make sure they continue saying their prayers in Hebrew so they shouldn't forget their traditions. It was very uplifting. You can see he was a leader, this Rabbi Maimon. He wasn't just a scholar. And Maimonides, 2 years later, penned probably the most famous letter that was ever written by any Jewish authority. That was called the Igeret Hashmad, the letter of conversion or of forced conversion, or the discourse or the treatise on sanctification of God's name. And this was provoked by a rabbi. We don't know who this rabbi was. He remains nameless. We don't even know where he was from. Probably from a country outside of the area where Jews were forced into conversion. And he castigated the Jews of Spain who converted publicly to Islam. And he said, you're not Jews anymore. You're a bunch of sinners. He really laced into them in so unforgiving words, telling them you're hypocrites. Don't even bother keeping Judaism privately because it's meaningless. You should have given your lives rather than converting to Islam. And he had absolutely no feelings of compassion for him. He was a very cold and very, very, very lethal barrage of insults that really undermined the faith of the Jews, and many of them thinking, maybe he's right, maybe again we should convert. So this was even worse than what happened before that Rabbi Maimon responded to. And now Maimonides, who's now still a youngster, he's in his 20s, writes this letter, a brilliant letter where he displayed brilliance and compassion as well. And in this letter, he condemns this rabbi, and he writes something very interesting. He said that when you write something, you first have to revisit what you're writing 3 or 4 times before you say something. If you publish something, in those days publishing meant writing it and disseminating it, you have to do it, review it 1,000 times. And this rabbi didn't bother to review what he was saying to the people. He says it's what he said to them is disgusting and it has no basis in Judaism. Number one, Maimonides said that Islam is not idolatry. We don't agree with their belief system, obviously. We don't believe in Muhammad. But to say that they're worshiping idols for which a Jew would have to suffer martyrdom, we don't believe that. That's not true. They're not idolaters. Number two, even if it would be true that the Jews should have suffered martyrdom rather than become publicly associated with Islam, the fact that they didn't under duress doesn't make them into evil people. You can understand why a person does not meet that challenge of giving up his or her life. Don't condemn them for that. It was done under duress. They didn't do it voluntarily. And then he said, the idea that if you did one thing wrong, you should not bother doing another thing right is preposterous. Judaism is not all or nothing. If it was all or nothing, we would all be doing nothing. Judaism is every mitzvah you do connects you to God. Every mitzvah you do makes you a better person. Every mitzvah you do makes you holier. And if we make mistakes, doesn't mean that cancels the good that we do. And he mentions the fact that he refers to a biblical king who was considered to be one of the most evil kings, Jeroboam. He says, Jeroboam committed every sin in the book, every big sin. God will still hold him accountable for the little sins as well. And by extension, no matter how bad you may be, you will get credit for everything good that you do. So Maimonides shows them tremendous amount of compassion, sees the good in them, encourages them to continue living a Jewish life as much as they can do. And then he makes a little bit of a U-turn. After he placates them, he shows them compassion, he uplifts them, he shows warmth and love. He says, but on the other hand, we have two hands. There's on one hand and there's the other hand. The other hand, you better leave. The fact that you're staying there and you're giving in to this tyranny is not excusable. Yes, you're not evil, you're not terrible sinners, you're not deserving of condemnation. Your Judaism still has value to God, but nevertheless, you should leave. Or if you can't leave, don't go out of your house where you have to profess your belief in another religion. Stay put in your home, or better still, leave. And that's what Maimonides' father did. He left, and he moved to Morocco. The only problem with Morocco is the Almohades were in control of Morocco as well. And there's a little bit of a mystery historically how he survived in Morocco for 4 years. So the Muslims say, he converted. Maimonides converted to Islam, which is the most preposterous thing in the world. There's no trace of it in any of his writings, in anything that he wrote, and it's the opposite of Maimonides, who would ever do anything contrary to his own belief system. The more plausible theory is that he became a disciple of a great rabbi who was very highly respected by the Muslims. Maimonides himself associated himself with great scholars, and the Muslims did appreciate scholarship more so than the Christians in those days. They were the ones who were steeped in philosophy. And where did Maimonides learn his Aristotelian philosophy? Where did he learn his medicine? All 100% of it from Muslim scholars. So while he was in Morocco, he befriended these people, and they had connections to the government, and he was safe, and they were very careful not to do things publicly. But after 4 years, there was an incident that happened that caused Maimonides' family to have to flee again. And that will continue in the next class. But let me just talk about his early works that he either completed or started when he was in Morocco. At the age of 24, depending on which day he was, when was he born, 1135, 1138, he started his major work, not his most important work, but one of his major works, a commentary on the Mishnah. And let me explain what that means. The Mishnah is the first draft of the oral teachings of Judaism that were transmitted orally and finally put into writing to prevent them from being forgotten. So the Mishnah is a code of law, and it embodies about 5,000 paragraphs. It has 60 different tractates, as they're called. And the Mishnah was later on elaborated on and explained, because the Mishnah was written very succinctly, by the Gemara, by the Talmud. Now, for people to learn Mishnah without Talmud, it's impossible, because the Mishnah was written in a way too cryptic for the average person to be able to understand it without the Talmud. Not everyone has the leisure, has the ability to study Talmud. So what Maimonides did was to create a digest of the Talmud and explain each Mishnah based on the Talmudic interpretation of the Mishnah. In addition to that, the Mishnah very often records differences of opinion. Maimonides would show us which opinion prevails. And he also defined different terminology, different vocabulary, which may be foreign to even a person who studies Mishnah and knows Hebrew. So he elucidated the Mishnah. That was a major work. It took him about 7 years to complete, but he started that in Morocco. He also wrote the treatise on logic that I mentioned before. He also wrote a commentary on the Talmud. Well, we only have fragments of that. He also did another thing, a major effort which we only have fragments of. I mentioned before that his father's teacher's teacher was known as the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, Rabbi Yitzchak from the city of Fez in Morocco. What catapulted him into fame? He took the whole Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, and condensed it so that you can study Talmud and know exactly where the Talmud is, which direction it's going. Because if you don't do that, the Talmud takes you in every direction imaginable. It'll give you all sorts of arguments back and forth. And that's what made this Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi famous. But there's also another Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud. And Maimonides wrote a condensed version of the Jerusalem Talmud, but we only have fragments of it that remain. The miracle is that all his other works remained, because in those days you didn't have printing presses. You didn't have the ability of just mass producing a work. You had to have a scribe who would sit down and write. Imagine you commission a scribe to write the Encyclopedia Britannica. How much time that would take, and how many copies could you possibly write? So this was a major challenge to preserve things that were written then. Now, the commentary on the Mishnah itself is divided into many books. Besides it being a commentary to all 6 orders and all 60 tractates, the commentary on the Mishnah contains introductions. There's first an introduction where he teaches you all about the transmission of Jewish law. It's a historical treatise. Then he has a section of 8 chapters, it's called, an introduction to ethics of the fathers, which is Maimonides' ethical teachings, psychological and ethical. Then there's the section where he establishes the creed of Judaism, the 13 principles of faith that I mentioned earlier. And then he has an introduction to one of the 6 orders, the laws of purity and impurity, that are very arcane laws, very, very difficult, and he gives an introduction to make them intelligible. So that essentially was his work on the Mishnah, major work. And this was only the beginning of Maimonides' career. Much more happened in his life, and much more was accomplished by him. So we'll have to come back next week, God willing, and we'll try to cover a little bit of Maimonides' advanced life. Thank you very much. Anyone has any questions?
You mentioned that he was very much into logic. Was he influenced at all by Greek philosophy and logic?
Absolutely. Maimonides considered Aristotle to be the greatest intellect.
Oh, he did?
Yes, he doesn't always agree with Aristotle. Part of the Guide for the Perplexed where he shows disagreement with Aristotle. But he held him in very high regard. Now, there's a famous description of Maimonides as a rationalist.
Okay.
Which is partially true. He was a rationalist and he was a super rationalist. He also believed in things going beyond rationality, that not all of life are things that you can contain in the human brain. There are things that are beyond the human brain. He believed very much in every aspect of Judaism. He just didn't believe in a lot of the occult, mystical teachings. Those he didn't believe in, and that was controversial also in his time. Almost everything Maimonides did was controversial. Actually, I forgot to mention that his commentary on the Mishnah, this major work, was not written in Hebrew, was written in Judeo-Arabic. Hebrew letters, but Arabic. And it was later on translated into Hebrew. He regretted it later in life. Now, my theory is, because when he wrote it, he considered it to be a popular work for simple, average people. He didn't consider it to be a scholarly work. In his humility, he said, who am I to contribute to the scholarly teachings? I'm going to write something for the masses who can't study Mishnah because they don't have the knowledge of the Gemara, of the Talmud. So the people spoke, like Jews in Eastern Europe spoke Yiddish. That's a Judeo-German. He wrote it in Judeo-Arabic. But later on, when it was translated, it became a major scholarly work. And everyone wanted to read it in Hebrew. That's why it was translated. So he really later on regretted it, because someone once asked him when he wrote his magnum opus in Hebrew, someone said, could we translate it into Arabic? He says, look, I regret writing my book in Arabic and had to be translated into Hebrew, and no translation is adequate. Now you want me to take my Hebrew and translate it into Arabic? So we did have a little bit of a sense of humor, yeah. Okay.